The first light of winter rose slow and aching over the Wyoming plains, painting the world in a pale wash of silver and blue. Elijah Crow rode through it with the steady patience of a man who had long since learned not to hurry grief. His horse's hooves thudded softly against the frozen earth, each breath from the animal drifting into the dawn like small offerings to the cold. Elijah had intended only to check the far pasture fences before the storm returned, yet something in instinct, or a memory pulled him toward the riverbank where the wind always sounded like whispered warnings. That was when he heard it. A sound too thin to be the cry of any creature meant for the wild. A human sound, small as a thread pulled loose from the fabric of the world. He reined in, listening. The wind carried it again, faint but unmistakable. He rode toward it, heart tightening, and found her half buried in drifted snow, her body curled as if trying to disappear into the cold. The sight froze him in place, not from the weather, but from a memory he'd spent years learning to live beside. Elijah dismounted, boots breaking the crusted snow, and knelt beside the woman. She looked no older than 20. Her skin was pale as the frost around her, her lips cracked. Her breathing shallow enough to scare him. Pinned to her coat was a small scrap of paper, its ink blurred by sleet. No one's child. Elijah could not touch it. He stared at the note as the world around him grew entirely still, as if even the winter were holding its breath. He had buried his sister on a winter not much different from this another life. Another version of himself, and the ache of old failure flared in his chest with unwelcome heat. But the past was not what lay freezing before him now. He lifted the young woman carefully, surprised by how light she was, how cold. Her head fell against his shoulder. She did not open her eyes. He wrapped his coat around her and whispered without thinking, his voice roughened by the wind and something deeper. "You're safe now. I've got you." The ride back felt longer than it should. The mare struggled in the deep snow, and Elijah kept glancing down to make sure the girl still breathed. She did, though each breath sounded like a battle. He pressed her closer, protecting her from the wind's teeth, and tried to ignore the fear curling in his gut. It had been a long time since he'd let himself worry for someone. Longer still since he'd carried a life so fragile in his arms. When he reached his cabin, storm was beginning to gather again, clouds rolling like bruises across the sky. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, carried the girl inside, and laid her on the narrow bed near the hearth. He lit the fire with hands steadier than he felt and filled the room with the scent of burning pine and warmth. It was only after she'd been covered with blankets and he'd coaxed the fire to life that he allowed himself to breathe. Hours passed before she stirred. He sat quietly at the table, carving a small scrap of wood into the shape of a horse simply to keep his hands busy. When she shifted beneath the blankets, he set the carving aside and rose slowly so as not to startle her, her eyes open to the crackle of the fire, their color uncertain in the dim light somewhere between green and gray, like river stones hidden beneath water. She recoiled immediately, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, as if expecting harm. "You're in my home," Elijah said gently, keeping his voice low. "Found you out by the river? You are near frozen." She blinked, confused, her gaze darting around the small room. The cabin was modest Struffian wood, a single bed, a stove, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and beans, but warm. Safe. Yet safety was a language she did not seem fluent in. Don't come closer," she whispered, her voice brittle. "I won't." Elijah stepped back until his shoulders nearly touched the wall. "You're free to rest. Nothing more is asked of you." Something in her expression cracked for a heartbeat, fear softening into exhaustion. She attempted to sit up, but swayed, and Elijah instinctively stepped forward before stopping himself. "Take it slow," he said. "You've been days in the cold, from the look of it." She dropped her gaze, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "Why did you bring me here?" Elijah leaned against the chair, keeping distance. "Because no one deserves to freeze alone." "Because I could help." He paused, unsure how much to say. "Because I've lost someone before, and I won't lose another if I can help it." At that, her eyes flickered, curiosity tempered by suspicion. I don't know your name. Elijah Crow. She said nothing, only nodded, though the name seemed to settle her a little. When he placed a tin cup of warm broth on the table and then backed away, she watched him as if weighing the sincerity of every movement. Eventually, she reached for it with trembling hands. They said no more that night. The wind battered the cabin walls, but inside there was quiet warmth. The faint clatter of the fire shifting, the soft sound of the girl breathing more evenly. By morning, color had begun returning to her cheeks. Elijah offered her his spare coat before stepping outside to tend to the horses. When he returned, he found her standing by the window, holding the note he'd taken from her coat. Her thumb brushed the ink-stained words with a mixture of pain and resignation. I'm not. She swallowed. I'm not anyone's burden. I'll leave when I'm able. Elijah shook his head gently. You're not a burden, and you don't owe me anything. Stay until you're strong enough to decide what you want. Her eyes darted toward him, searching. People weren't generous in her world. He could see that written in the way she guarded every word.
Every gesture?
What's your name? He asked softly. Mara, she murmured, as if remembering it hurt. Mara Lynn. The days that followed moved with the steady rhythm of winter life. Mara regained strength slowly. She helped with chores when she could, patching a torn saddle strap, sweeping the floor, mending a shirt Elijah hadn't realized was fraying. She did it all with a quiet determination, as though proving she belonged nowhere had been her life's training. And trying to belong somewhere new required careful, silent effort. Elijah noticed things. The way she hummed old melodies while warming her hands by the fire. The way she grew still whenever he entered the room, as if bracing for judgment that never came. The way she studied the horses with a tenderness that suggested she understood creatures accustomed to fear in his own way. Elijah offered small gestures in return, leaving a pair of wool socks folded beside her bed. Setting a second mug on the table even before she woke, keeping his movements slow, easy. Unobtrusive trust was an animal too skittish to approach directly. One afternoon, when the light slanted gold against the snow, Elijah took Mara into Whisper Creek to gather supplies. The moment they stepped into Clara May's store, whispers rose like dust that the stray girl Elijah found. Pretty thing, but trouble always is. No one's child, they say. Mara stiffened, shoulders tightening. Elijah saw it. There was an old shame they're older than whatever had driven her into the snow. He paid for their supplies quickly and guided her outside, but the damage had been done. That night, she sat by the fire long after the flames sank to embers. Elijah sensed words gathering behind her silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. People talk about me like I'm something broken. Elijah sat across from her, elbows on his knees. People talk about anything they don't understand. Fear disguises itself as judgment more often than not. Mara looked into the embers. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. You haven't? He replied. You're trying to heal. That's not trouble. But healing rarely moves in straight lines. That night, Mara woke from a nightmare. Elijah heard her muffled gasp through the thin wall. She whispered a name, one that made Elijah's jaw tighten. Silas. He didn't press. Instead, he lit a lantern and set it outside her door, letting its glow spill across the cabin floor. A quiet promise. You're not alone in the dark. By the next morning. Mara looked at him with something new in her gaze, a tentative trust, fragile but real. She helped feed the horses, her touch gentle, her movements patient. Elijah watched her from a distance, feeling the old ache in him shift. She wasn't just a rescued stranger now. She was someone with a story, someone trying to survive its shadows. Yet even as quiet warmth grew between them, Elijah could sense a storm approaching, one not made of snow. Word in town said a man named Silas Drayton was asking questions. A cattle broker with a cruel reputation? A man who believed people could be owned. When Elijah heard the name spoken aloud in the saloon, something fierce awakened in him. Protector, survivor. Brother to the girl the winter once stole from him. He rode home with urgency, tightening every muscle. Mara sat by the fire when he returned, her face soft in the flickering light. She looked up, sensing the shift in him. Elijah removed his gloves slowly, choosing his words with care. Someone's been asking around town. A man named Silas, her face blanched, the color draining as if pulled by an unseen hand. She whispered the name like it tasted of iron. He won't let me go. Elijah stepped closer to the fire, letting its warmth spread between them. No one claims you here, Mara. Not now. Not ever. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something bruised and frightened flickered behind her eyes, but so did something brave. Outside, the wind rose again, dragging the storm back over the plains. Inside, Mara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to run anymore." Elijah nodded, knowing the quiet war they were about to face. And though neither said it, they both understood. Winter had brought her to his door. But spring, if it dared to come, would not find her alone. The thaw began quietly, not in the land, but in Mara herself. She rose earlier each morning, the stiffness of fear giving way to a steadier stride. Though frost still clung to the windows, her movements held a faint warmth Elijah had not seen before small, emerging signs of a life that had not been entirely extinguished by the cold she'd come from. She fed the horses without being asked, humming under her breath. Soft tunes that carried just enough melody to make Elijah pause in the doorway and listen. She spoke more now, not in long stories but in simple observations, how the snow melted faster near the cedar tree, how the roan mare favored her left leg, how the silence here felt gentler than silence anywhere else. Elijah answered in the same unhurried manner, letting connection grow in the spaces between words instead of pushing it into form. Yet the townsfolk were not as patient. Whisper Creek had a way of taking secrets, stretching them thin and hanging them in plain sight for all to judge. Each time Elijah and Mara went to town for provisions, eyes followed them. Some were curious. Others were wary. Most were unkind. Clara May, in particular, wore her suspicions openly, as if the weight of them lent her posture a kind of authority. Mara tried to ignore the stares, but shame clung to her like the smell of smoke on clothes old, persistent and difficult to wash out. Elijah noticed the way her shoulders tightened, the way her voice shrank. He chose his words carefully, offering quiet assurance instead of grand gestures, knowing she trusted gentleness more than promises. One afternoon, while they loaded supplies onto the wagon, Clara May finally spoke what the others only whispered. A girl with no past seldom brings a man anything but trouble. Her tone carried the conviction of someone who believed she was protecting the town from a storm. The words hit Mara with visible force. Her hands stilled, her breath caught, and the flicker of warmth she had nurtured for weeks dimmed again. Elijah opened his mouth to respond, but Mara shook her head. Unwilling to let him fight her battles, unwilling to invite conflict that might reflect badly on him, they rode home in silence. The sky above was a delicate gray, threatening snow. Mara watched the powdery fields pass by, her face unreadable. Elijah felt a tension building in her, a pressure, like a river trapped beneath ice, seeking the smallest crack to escape through. That night, she scarcely ate. She went to bed early, her footsteps soft, almost apologetic. Elijah sensed goodbye in the air, though she had not spoken it. He sat at the table long after the fire weakened, carving wood into the shape of a sparrow, wondering if giving someone safety could ever counter the fear of taking it away. Before dawn, Mara slipped quietly from the cabin. The world was still asleep, the light barely brushing the horizon with the faintest whisper of silver. She saddled Elijah's gentlest horse with trembling hands. Her breath made small clouds in the cold, and her fingers shook as she tied them against the chill. She left a note on the workbench, written in the slanted, uncertain script of someone who had not expected her words to be read by anyone who cared. She whispered a soft apology to the empty cabin, mounted the horse, and rode toward the trail that led away from Elijah's land and back into the wide, different world. But she wasn't alone on the path. A silhouette waited for her, dark against the pale rising light. The shape of him froze Mara instantly. Silas Drayton stepped forward with a slow, deliberate smile that looked carved rather than lived. His coat was heavy, lined with fur, his boots polished even in the weather. His voice slithered through the cold. "Thought you could run forever, did you?" Mara felt her throat tighten. She tugged the reins instinctively, but the horse sensed her fear and shifted restlessly. Silas stepped closer, his expression unchanged. "You belong to me. You know that. And you should have learned your lesson the first time." The words hit her like blows she'd felt before. Her strength faltered. The world seemed to tilt, making escape impossible. Silas grabbed her arm, yanking her from the saddle with a force that stole her breath. She hit the ground hard enough to see stars, and he dragged her toward the wagon waiting in the shadows. Elijah found her note moments later. The cabin was still cold. The ink on the page had barely dried. He read her words, "Thank you for warmth. I won't bring trouble to your door," and a tightness pulled across his chest. The sparrow carving fell from his hand. He saddled his horse without a second thought, spurred it into the fresh snow, and followed her trail with a clarity sharpened by fear. His pulse thundered, not with panic, but with something older and unspoken promise that he would not lose someone again. Not to winter, not to cruelty, not to the world's indifference. He found signs of struggle near the ridge. A single glove, a disturbed patch of snow, tracks leading toward the canyon. He pressed harder, the horse snorting clouds into the icy air. He reached the frozen gorge to see. Silas's wagon stopped near the thinning ice where the river churned beneath layers of brittle glass. Silas dragged Mara from the wagon, yelling that she was his, that she had always been his. She fought, weak but desperate, and Elijah dismounted before thought could shape itself into words. He approached slowly, shoulders squared, every movement controlled. Mara saw him first. Relief flickered in her eyes, followed instantly by fear for him. Silas turned, annoyance curdling into hostility. "Crow," he sneered. "This isn't your business." Elijah stopped a few paces away. "Let her go." Silas laughed, a cold, jagged sound. "You think you can take what's mine? You think kindness makes you a savior?" He tightened his grip on Mara, making her cry out. "She's nothing. Nothing but a runaway." Elijah's voice held a quiet steel that made even the wind hesitate. "She's a human being, and she chooses where she stands." The struggle erupted with sudden violence, not gunshots, not grand heroics, but raw, desperate force. They grappled dangerously close to the river's edge, boots slipping on the thin crust of ice. Mara scrambled back, breath ragged, watching fearfully as the men fought. Silas swung wildly. Elijah blocked him, shoved him away. Die. But the ice beneath them cracked like a lightning strike. The sound was sharp, going through the canyon. Silas stumbled backward, the ice giving way beneath him. He plunged through with a roar of freezing water. Elijah reached out instinctively, but the current dragged Silas down before he could be grabbed. In seconds, the river swallowed him. The ice closed over the struggling shape. The water beneath rushing on with indifferent power. Elijah staggered back from the edge, breath heavy, chest heaving. Mara rushed to him, her hands trembling as she touched his coat, grounding him. He covered her hand with his own, both shivering from cold and adrenaline. Sheriff Boone, having followed Elijah's trail, arrived moments later. He took in the scene quickly, face grim. When he asked if Mara wished to press charge as if she wished the law to pursue anything tied to Silas's name, she shook her head with surprising steadiness. "No more chains." She whispered, "I want a life that's mine." Boone nodded, respect softening his stern features. Elijah guided Mara back to the horse, holding her as though afraid she might disappear with the wind. The ride home was quiet, the canyon behind them fading into the white horizon. Mara leaned against him, exhausted, trusting the warmth at her back. When they reached the cabin, she hesitated at the threshold. For the first time, Elijah did not speak first. He let her choose. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the room as if seeing it anew. On the table lay the sparrow he had carved, a small, imperfect bird with wings half open, ready to rise. She picked it up gently. "Did you make this?" Elijah nodded, feeling suddenly uncertain. "Just something to keep my hands busy. Looks like it's learning to fly," she murmured. "Maybe it is." She placed the bird on the shelf near the hearth and turned toward him. Her expression tender, hesitant, but steady. "I'd like to stay, if that's still all right," his answer came quietly. "The door stays open for you, Mara. Always." Spring would come in time, but neither of them waited for its permission. They sat together by the fire as the storm rose again outside. Two survivors, learning the shape of safety, of belonging, of something that had not yet asked to be named, and deep within the winter, warmth finally bloomed.